Imagine building the most expensive fighter jet in history and then deliberately removing everything that makes a fighter jet a fighter jet. No radar, no missiles for dogfighting, no afterburner, no speed. An aircraft so aerodynamically unstable that without computers constantly adjusting its controls, it would tumble out of the sky in less than half a second. An aircraft that looked so strange, so alien, that when pilots first saw it, some genuinely asked if it was recovered from a UFO crash site. This is the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk, and I have to tell you, the more I researched this aircraft, the more I realized that everything I thought I knew about air combat was wrong, because this ugly, slow, defenseless aircraft did something no plane had ever done before. It made radar, the technology that had dominated aerial warfare since World War II, essentially useless. And that single achievement terrified Soviet generals more than any nuclear missile ever could. Because if American aircraft could fly through the most sophisticated air defense networks in the world completely undetected, then every assumption the Soviet Union had made about defending its territory, every billion rubles spent on surface-to-air missiles and radar installations, every strategic calculation about the balance of power, all of it became worthless overnight. Before we dive deep into this extraordinary story, if you find this kind of content fascinating, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these in-depth explorations of military aviation history. Now, let's get into it. To understand why the F-117 was designed the way it was, you first need to understand a problem that had been haunting American military planners since the Vietnam War. And that problem had a name: surface-to-air missiles. During the Vietnam War, the United States lost nearly 1,000 aircraft to enemy fire, and while many of those losses came from conventional anti-aircraft guns, the introduction of Soviet-made SA-2 guideline missiles changed everything. These missiles were radar-guided, meaning they could track aircraft at distances and altitudes where human gunners couldn't even see them. American pilots developed tactics to evade these missiles. They used electronic jamming, they flew at extremely low altitudes, they attacked radar sites directly, but every countermeasure had a countermeasure, and the fundamental problem remained: if radar could see you, missiles could kill you. By the early 1970s, Soviet air defense technology had advanced dramatically. The SA-6 gainful missile system, which the Soviets exported to Egypt and Syria, proved devastatingly effective during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In the first few days of that conflict, Israeli aircraft losses were catastrophic. I want you to really understand this. Israel had some of the best pilots in the world, flying some of the most advanced Western aircraft available, and they were being shot down at rates that would have made air operations unsustainable in a prolonged conflict. The message was clear. Flying into a modern, integrated air defense system was practically suicide. And here's the thing that really worried American planners. The Soviets had built the most extensive air defense network in human history. Thousands of radar installations, thousands of missile launchers, thousands of anti-aircraft guns, all linked together in a coordinated system designed specifically to destroy American and NATO aircraft. If war ever broke out in Europe, American pilots would be flying into a wall of radar-guided death. So the question became, how do you survive in that environment? You could try to overwhelm the defenses with sheer numbers, but that meant accepting massive casualties. You could try to jam the radar, but jamming technology and radar technology were locked in an endless back-and-forth battle, with neither side ever gaining a permanent advantage. You could fly at extremely low altitudes, below radar coverage, But that made you vulnerable to anti-aircraft guns and short-range missiles, and it was exhausting for pilots and hard-on aircraft. None of these solutions were satisfactory. What American planners really wanted was something that seemed impossible. They wanted an aircraft that radar simply couldn't see. Now, the idea of reducing an aircraft's radar signature wasn't new. Engineers had understood the basic principle since the 1940s. Radar works by bouncing radio waves off objects and detecting the reflections. The bigger and more reflective the object, the stronger the return signal. So, in theory, if you could make an aircraft smaller and less reflective, it would be harder to detect. But, in practice, this was incredibly difficult. Aircraft needed wings to fly, and wings were excellent radar reflectors. They needed engines, and engine intakes were like perfect radar mirrors. They needed cockpits, and glass canopies reflected radar beautifully. Every practical requirement of flight seemed to contradict the requirements of radar invisibility. Various attempts had been made to reduce radar signatures. The SR-71 Blackbird incorporated some stealth features, including radar-absorbing materials and carefully shaped engine inlets. The B-1 bomber program included signature reduction in its design goals, but these were incremental improvements, not revolutionary changes. The aircraft were still clearly visible on radar, just somewhat less visible than they might otherwise have been. What happened next is, I think, one of the most remarkable stories in aviation history, and it started with a Soviet scientist named Pyotr Ufimtsev. In 1962, Ufimtsev published a paper with the incredibly boring title, Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. This paper dealt with the mathematical prediction of how electromagnetic waves, including radar waves, would scatter when they hit objects of various shapes. Now, Ufimtsev wasn't thinking about stealth aircraft when he wrote this. He was doing pure theoretical physics, and the Soviet military apparently didn't recognize the implications of his work because they allowed it to be published openly, and eventually it was translated into English and ended up in the library of the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And there it sat, unread and unappreciated, until a Lockheed engineer named Dennis Overholser happened to find it. What Overholser realized was extraordinary. Ufimtsev's equations provided a way to precisely calculate how radar waves would reflect off complex shapes. Until then, predicting radar reflections from anything other than simple geometric forms had been essentially impossible, requiring expensive and time-consuming physical testing. But with Ufimtsev's mathematics, you could design a shape on paper and calculate exactly how visible it would be to radar before you ever built anything. Overholser took this idea to his boss at Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division, a brilliant and unconventional engineer named Ben Rich, and what he proposed was radical. Instead of trying to make a conventional aircraft slightly less visible, what if they designed an aircraft whose shape was specifically optimized to deflect radar waves away from their source? What if invisibility to radar was the primary design requirement and everything else, speed, maneuverability, payload, was secondary? Rich was intrigued but skeptical. He asked Overholser how small a radar signature they could theoretically achieve. The answer stunned him. Overholser believed they could make an aircraft that would appear on radar as no larger than a ball bearing. An object weighing several tons with a wingspan of over 40 feet would be essentially invisible. Rich famously replied, "Well, Dennis, if we can do that, we'll make Lockheed $1 billion. What neither man knew at the time was that they would make Lockheed many billions of dollars, and they would fundamentally transform aerial warfare in the process. The program that resulted was classified at the highest levels. It was initially called HAV, Blue, and it was so secret that even most people at Lockheed didn't know it existed. The team worked in a heavily guarded facility cut off from the outside world. They were designing something that had never existed before, and they were doing it with the knowledge that if they failed, the Soviet Union would maintain its air defense superiority, and American pilots would continue to die in any future conflict. The shape they eventually developed was unlike anything in aviation history. Because Ufimtsev's equations worked best with flat surfaces, the aircraft was covered in faceted panels like a diamond or cut gemstone. This gave it an angular, pyramidal appearance that looked more like abstract sculpture than an airplane. Every angle was calculated to reflect radar waves away at predictable angles, away from the transmitter rather than back toward it. There were no curved surfaces, no right angles, nothing that would create a strong radar return. The edges of the wings and tail were aligned at specific angles that would scatter radar energy in directions where receivers weren't located. The result was an aircraft that violated almost every principle of conventional aerodynamic design. It wasn't streamlined, it wasn't elegant, it wasn't beautiful in any traditional sense. In fact, early computer models predicted it would be unflyable. The shape was so inherently unstable that no human pilot could possibly control it using conventional means. But this was where another technological revolution came into play. The F-117 would be controlled by a quadruple redundant fly-by-wire computer system that would make constant adjustments to the control surfaces hundreds of times per second to keep the aircraft stable. The pilot would tell the computer what he wanted the aircraft to do, and the computer would figure out how to make that happen without the aircraft tumbling out of control. I want you to appreciate how revolutionary this was. The engineers were deliberately designing an aircraft that couldn't fly in any conventional sense, trusting that computers would make it flyable. If the computers failed, the pilot had no chance. There was no manual backup, no possibility of controlling the aircraft through skill alone. This was a complete departure from the entire history of aviation, where aircraft were designed to be inherently stable and pilots were trained to fly them manually. The F-117 represented a fundamental shift in philosophy. The machine would no longer be designed around the limits of human control. Human control would be mediated through computers that could handle complexity beyond human capability. 2. Have-blue prototypes were built and tested in complete secrecy at a remote location in the Nevada desert that would later become famous as Area 51. The first flight took place in December 1977, and the results exceeded expectations. The aircraft was astonishingly invisible to radar. During testing, it was tracked by the most sophisticated radar systems the United States possessed, and it frequently disappeared from screens entirely. On one famous occasion, the radar signature of the aircraft was smaller than the radar return, from the screws holding the aircraft together. The stealth concept worked. It worked better than anyone had dared hope, but the have-blue prototypes were just proof-of-concept vehicles. They were too small to carry any useful weapons payload, and they were fragile, hand-built machines unsuitable for operational service. Both prototypes eventually crashed during testing, though fortunately without loss of life. What was needed now was a production aircraft that could actually go to war. This became the F-117 Nighthawk, though that designation itself is interesting and worth discussing for a moment. The F in F-117 stands for fighter, but the aircraft was never designed to be a fighter in any meaningful sense. It had no air-to-air capability whatsoever. It couldn't dogfight, it couldn't engage enemy aircraft, it couldn't even defend itself if attacked. It was purely an attack aircraft designed to deliver precision-guided bombs against high-value ground targets. So why was it called a fighter? The official explanation has varied over the years, but I believe it was primarily a combination of security considerations and pilot recruitment. Fighter pilots were generally considered the elite of the Air Force, and attracting top talent to a secret program was easier if you were offering them a fighter assignment rather than an attack or bomber assignment. The F-117 designation was also unusual, as it didn't fit into any standard numbering sequence. This may have been another security measure designed to confuse anyone trying to track American aircraft development programs. The F-117A entered service in 1983, but it remained completely secret until 1988. For 5 years, an entire squadron of operational stealth aircraft flew missions in total darkness, literally and figuratively. The aircraft only flew at night to prevent visual detection, and the entire program was classified at a level where even acknowledging its existence was a crime. Pilots were forbidden from telling their families what they flew. The aircraft's existence was so closely guarded that when one crashed in 1986, killing the pilot, the Air Force issued a cover story about an F-101 accident rather than reveal the truth. The secrecy had operational implications. Because the aircraft flew only at night and because pilots couldn't discuss their work with other aviators, the F-117 community developed its own distinct culture and tactics. They called themselves bandits, and they developed a unique approach to air warfare. They couldn't rely on the traditional strengths of fighter pilots, speed, maneuverability, and aggressive tactics. Instead, they had to be methodical, precise, and patient. A successful F-117 mission wasn't about outflying the enemy, it was about outsmarting them, getting in, hitting the target, and getting out before anyone knew you were there. Let me explain what made the F-117 so revolutionary from a tactical standpoint. In conventional air warfare, attacking a heavily defended target requires what's called a strike package. This is a coordinated formation of many different aircraft, each with a specific role. You need aircraft to jam enemy radar. You need aircraft to attack the radar sites directly and suppress enemy air defenses. You need fighter aircraft to protect the bombers from enemy interceptors. You need the bombers themselves to hit the target. And you need tanker aircraft to refuel everyone along the way. A major strike against a well-defended target might involve dozens or even hundreds of aircraft, with all the complexity, coordination problems, and potential for casualties that implies. The F-117 could do it alone. A single aircraft could penetrate the most sophisticated air defenses in the world, destroy a critical target with precision weapons, and return home, all without being detected. No jamming aircraft needed, no defense suppression aircraft needed, no fighter escort needed. Just one plane, one pilot, and 2 bombs. I want you to think about what that means from a strategic perspective. The calculus of air defense had been completely overturned. It didn't matter how many radars you built, how many missiles you deployed, how many billions you spent on integrated air defense systems. If your enemy had stealth aircraft, all of that investment was potentially worthless. You couldn't defend against what you couldn't see. This is why I said at the beginning that Soviet generals were terrified, and they were genuinely terrified. Soviet military doctrine had been built around the assumption that air defense was a solvable problem. They had invested enormous resources in their air defense forces. The Vojska PVO, which was actually a separate branch of the military with its own command structure, its own equipment, and its own strategic role. The entire Soviet approach to defense assumed that American aircraft could be detected, tracked, and destroyed. The existence of stealth technology threatened to make all of that irrelevant. The Soviets knew stealth was theoretically possible. Of course, Ufimtsev was their scientist after all, but they apparently didn't believe the Americans could actually make it work at a practical level. When intelligence reports began suggesting that the United States might have operational stealth aircraft, Soviet leadership was deeply alarmed. They didn't know exactly what the Americans had built, but they knew their entire defensive strategy might be obsolete. And the psychological impact of that uncertainty was significant. How do you plan your defenses when you don't know if your defenses will work? Now let's talk about what the F-117 actually lacked, because understanding its limitations helps explain why its achievements were so remarkable. First, it had no radar. This might seem strange for a military aircraft, especially one that operated exclusively at night. How do you find your targets without radar? How do you navigate? How do you avoid obstacles? The answer is that radar would have given away the aircraft's position. Radar works by emitting radio waves, and any emissions can potentially be detected by an enemy. A stealth aircraft that radiated energy would be announcing its presence to anyone with the right receivers. So the F-117 flew completely passively. It received information but didn't transmit anything. For navigation and targeting, the aircraft relied on an infrared system called IRADS, the Infrared Acquisition and Designation System. This allowed the pilot to see targets at night using thermal imaging and to designate targets for laser-guided bombs. The system was remarkably sophisticated for its time, but it had significant limitations compared to radar. Its range was shorter, it was affected by weather conditions, and it required the pilot to maintain steady flight during the final moments of an attack to keep the laser on target. This made the F-117 vulnerable during the critical seconds before weapon release, a vulnerability that would later have consequences in combat. Second, the F-117 had no guns, not even a small cannon for self-defense. This was simply a weight and space consideration. Every pound devoted to guns and ammunition was a pound that couldn't be devoted to stealth features or bomb load. And since the aircraft's entire defensive strategy was based on not being detected in the first place, guns seemed unnecessary. If an enemy fighter ever got close enough to shoot at an F-117, something had already gone catastrophically wrong. The pilot's best response was to run and hide, not to fight. Third, the F-117 was slow. Its maximum speed was around 600 miles per hour, significantly slower than most fighters of its era. It couldn't use afterburner because the hot exhaust gases would create a massive infrared signature, making the aircraft visible to heat-seeking sensors. The engines were buried deep inside the fuselage, with special exhausts designed to cool and disperse the hot gases before they left the aircraft. This limited thrust, and therefore limited speed. But again, speed wasn't the point. Invisibility was the point.